I had a late day today. Yeah, so we're here now. We're gonna get into it. We're gonna do a little stuff. It's gonna be a good time. In the meantime, I think what we're gonna do today is we're just gonna listen to stuff in the background of just something interesting for the time being now. So let's uh, let's put on something a little more related to BattleTech, its history. That stuff's cool. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the first succession war. There's Sven Vanderpike, amazing lore YouTuber who does BattleTech stuff. Specifically, is covering the entirety of BattleTech's lore and history. I think it'll be a fun little adventure. And we'll paint minis in the meantime. Yeah. Have a little knob of whiskey.
As every soul alive today knows, humankind has been locked in a death spiral known as the Succession Wars since the final collapse of the Star League. The first of these began almost immediately after Alexander Kerensky's exodus over 240 years ago, and there has been less than a decade of quiet since. Even dividing this period into separate conflicts remains a contentious issue among historians, as in many cases low-level fighting continued and a peace agreement was never reached. In its day, what we now call the First was simply known as the Great Succession War, and the idea that the chain of conflicts would continue for another 2 centuries was inconceivable. The era of the Star League was bookended by 2 of the most devastating calamities humanity had ever known: the Reunification War and the Star League Civil War. Each directly resulted in over 100 million deaths in less than 2 decades. Despite its fabled reputation as a time of unity, by the latter years of the Star League, the Inner Sphere was poised for self-destruction. Kerensky's defense force was the only thing keeping the proverbial foot on the brake. But with their departure, there was nothing left to keep the great houses in check. The cataclysm that followed would lead to more wartime casualties than humanity's 100 millennia of history combined. By the end of 2784, this outcome had become an inevitability. Throughout the era of the Star League, each individual nation had been carefully kept in check, but with the shocking exodus of the peacekeeping SLDF, those left behind suddenly found themselves on equal footing. The seat of power was vacant, and supremacy over all was attainable. The ruling Cameron line had been exterminated during the Amaris coup, as had the usurper Amaris' offspring, and perhaps the only realistic candidate to replace them had left on a self-imposed exile. The surviving associate members had won their freedom during the brutal Periphery Uprising, the long-suffering territorial states having little interest in continued involvement in the League. This left the 5 council lords of the other member states, none with the authority to claim the position of First Lord outright, but all covetous of the power that came with it. If they wanted to press their claim, they would have to do so through force of arms. Humanity's slow slide back into feudalism was at its high watermark around this point. The fate of trillions within the Inner Sphere were now controlled by just a handful of ruling dynasties. The 5 heads of state that had disbanded the High Council in 2781, more through fear that their rivals would use it to seize power than a willingness to give it up themselves, were first Prince John Davian of the Federated Sons, Coordinator Minoru Kurita of the Draconis Combine, Captain General Kenyon Manic of the Free Worlds League, Chancellor Barbara Liao of the Capellan Confederation, and Archon Robert Steiner II of the Lyran Commonwealth. Upon the latter's return to his capital of Tharkad, he immediately fell ill and died shortly afterwards, the prevailing rumour at the time being that it was divine retribution for his involvement in the breakup of the Star League. His sister Jennifer took up the Archonship in his stead. These 5 would in time come to be known as the Successor Lords, a title that is still jealously clung to by their descendants to this day. The First Succession War was a true free-for-all, with no meaningful alliances to speak of. Nor was there a single event that kicked off the fighting on all fronts simultaneously. As such, natives of each realm often date the conflict based on their own individual histories. However, more often than not, the engagements that took place in the years between Kerensky's departure and the point at which each head of state declared their first lordship are segregated into a period known as the Phony War, and it began within the ruins of the Terran hegemony. The nation that had grown up around humanity's birthplace was at one time the mightiest of all the interstellar states. Now, it was an irradiated wasteland. The SLDF had done their best to manage the humanitarian crisis as they advanced towards Terra, but many planets were still barely surviving at a subsistence level, while others were completely abandoned. Racing to their aid were the noble Great Houses, flooding the outer worlds with relief efforts, and thereby clandestinely positioning themselves to claim ownership of those systems in the coming years. Some of the threatened planets attempted to band together into new realms, as had happened following the breakup of the Terran Alliance centuries earlier. The core worlds were in the worst state, still protected by the remnants of the Starleague Defense Force, unofficially helmed by Jerome Blake. His branch of government, the Department of Communications, was the last vestige of the once colossal Bureau of Starleague Affairs. His efforts made him the face of the recovery, without whom countless millions would have starved. Indeed, among some citizens, he was an almost saintly figure. Throughout the previous 2 years, the soon-to-be successor states had been claiming worlds along their borders, gradually closing in around Terra. One of the most rapacious was the Free Worlds League. The Captain General had faced a crisis when the League fell, as that institution was what had assured the Madoc family continued dynasty over their realm. With war in the offing, he was able to convince his government to agree to Resolution 288 on December 19, 2784, which would grant him supreme authority for the duration of the crisis, forestalling any talk of a reduction in Madoc power. The seized hegemony worlds were touted as bountiful prizes, made possible only through his actions, their sorry condition kept hidden from the public by his intelligence agency, SAFE. The voracious appetite of the other ruling lords led them to continue to absorb planets into their empires wherever they could, but before they came into conflict with Blake and his SLDF forces, they ran into each other. Town was one of the former hegemony worlds seized by the Federated Suns in 2783, and would be one of the ignition points of the Phony War. The occupation force on Town came from 2 regions of Davian space. The Hussars redeployed from Collier in the Fairfax combat region, while the Interceptors transferred across from Ulaanbaatar in the Chesterton ZR. Their place of origin seemed an insignificant fact to the Federated Suns High Command, but they were about to discover how dysfunctional their military had become. Spending cuts on transportation, coupled with a lack of action over the past few decades, have resulted in the armed forces of the Federated Suns becoming increasingly provincial, with stronger ties to their home planet than their compatriots elsewhere in the AFFS. When the 2 deployed to Town, they took up responsibility for one hemisphere each, and had little to no communication or combat drills together. A military coincidence soon brought their lack of cooperation into sharp focus. Arriving in system near simultaneously in February 2785, were a battalion-sized raiding force each from the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces and the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery. Neither was working with the other, and both had their own individual targets. Majors Wilkins and Donner argued about how to respond to the incoming raiders, their inability to reach a consensus allowing the hostile forces time to make landfall on opposite ends of Town virtually unopposed. They swept across the planet, ransacking what military equipment they could reach, while causing widespread destruction and loss of life. 4,000 died in the 2 weeks it took for the Hussars and Interceptors to come together and force the Capellan and Combine forces to withdraw. In the aftermath of the debacle, the First Prince passed the Town Charter, which gave the militia free rein to take what they needed from the AFFS warehouses, though this was of little comfort to the dead. Elsewhere in the Terran hegemony, the successor states continued to gobble up undefended worlds. The same was true for several jointly administered planets along the borders between other states. The Capellan seizure of Alexa the previous year had caused considerable concern among the field marshals of the Federated Sons, as they had fought a brief border war with the Confederation just 2 decades earlier. When they took Andro in 2785, Chief of MI2 Dana Bancroft advised the First Prince that the Capellans were about to launch a campaign against him, a warning that he took to heart. Across the Inner Sphere, the Lyran Commonwealth had the same concerns about the Free Worlds League's efforts to take full control of jointly administered worlds along their border, and they were right to think so. Kenyon Maddock had been moving supplies to the Bolan Thumb in preparation of a major assault for some years now, but Kerensky's exodus had diverted his attention, along with the additional regiments meant to take up positions within the region, to the softer, juicier targets of the Terran hegemony. Steiner had long chafed at the existence of the Bolan salient jutting into their territory. With Kerensky no longer on the map, Lyran High Command began making preparations for what would be known as Operation Elbow Joint. General of the armies Paul Steiner was the mastermind behind the Bolan offensive, with command of the task force given to Lieutenant General Baron Richard Johansson von Eilenberg, a veteran of Operation Almanac. Participating in the attack would be 3 mech and 6 conventional regiments, as well as 7 of the Navy's warships, a trio of Commonwealth-class cruisers, and a quartet of Mako-class corvettes. The defence of the world was orchestrated from within the old SLDF base known as the Overwatch. Notionally in charge of the 2 mech regiments, 3 League-class destroyers and single Aegis-class cruiser deployed to Bolan was Colonel Salam Tut. The operation began on March 7th, when the merchant transport Lucian Bell arrived at the system's zenith. 2 squadrons of aerospace fighters exited the vessel and swiftly destroyed every non-Lyran craft at the jump point, while a dropship ferried Marines across to take control of the customs station. The LCS Furillo now appeared, transporting the Sky Rangers invasion troops. The station's occupants desperately tried to contact Bolan, but their message would take hours to arrive yet. Long before then, the remaining 6 warships and 8 regiments of the LCAF arrived at a pirate point, in position to intercept the planet's solar orbit. The space battle began poorly for the overeager Commonwealth Navy. Their corvettes raced ahead to engage the heavier League destroyers. Tiberium took the worst pounding, but was able at least to force the Nerva to withdraw. The ship was failing though, and in an act of desperation, plotted a collision course with the inbound Donegal. The Lyran crew was able to evade the ramming attack, and devastated the Tiberium with a broadside in the process, sending the League vessel tumbling into orbit. Meanwhile, the other 2 cruisers engaged each other with withering fire. Caledonia suffered heavy damage, but outperformed the much older Manaslu, which was blown apart by a pair of nuclear-armed missiles. The remaining League-class destroyers continued to fight for a time, bringing down a pair of Makos, but had to withdraw as the Furillo approached from the jump point. The Lyrans achieved naval supremacy by the 13th. The LCAF began landing the next day. Orbital guns located within the Overwatch made approaching the Sabari island chain all but impossible. This focused the action on the 2 continents of Kashmir and Saket, and the 4 major cities on world. The Arcturan Guards made landfall at Peshawar, quickly eliminating all resistance in the area. While their aerospace fighters swept the surrounding townships for targets, Johansson threatened an imminent attack on Calcutta. Instead, the attack came 2 days later at Quetta, on the opposite side of the planet. Furillo arrived overhead to bombard the spaceport, while the Sky Rangers descended to lay siege to the city below. Meanwhile, the 11th Arcturan Guards were boosted across world to assault the capital city of Mumbai. A day-long bombardment left both cities in ruins. On March 18th, the Lyrans' massed aerospace assets conducted a brutal firebombing campaign at Calcutta, obliterating all resistance within and claiming the lives of some 20,000 civilians. That number is only an estimate, as what happened next makes the true figure unknowable. Colonel Tut ordered all units to rush the Lyran positions and pin them in place, while he began launch procedures. As the fighting grew fierce, the first nuclear weapons began descending on the 4 major cities of Bolan, annihilating both Freeworlders and Lyrans alike. The Lieutenant General quickly raced his naval assets towards the Overwatch and unleashed his full arsenal on the base below to stop the launches. The Bolan defenders had enough dropships on hand to lift just one of their battalions off-world, their remaining destroyers in orbit perishing in a rearguard action. The Lyran Commonwealth had achieved its first victory of the Succession Wars, but it had come at a heavy cost. Around 45% of their invasion force had been destroyed, and Bolan itself had been devastated. In the aftermath of Operation Elbow Joint, Kenyon Maddock officially declared a state of war between the Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth. He also stated that the conduct of the fighting on Bolan made it clear that neither side had any intention of sticking to the mythical and long-defunct Ares conventions. Henceforth, the FWLM had free rein to use their full strategic arsenal. He may have regretted that decision later that year, when a pair of Commonwealth-class cruisers arrived at the recently seized hegemony planet Denebola. Colonel DeWitt felt little compunction about ordering orbital strikes to devastate the forces sheltering in the old SLDF base below. Likewise, they quickly dispatched the pair of Vincent-class corvettes in orbit, clearing the path for their own ground troops to make landfall and claim Denebola as their own. On the Commonwealth Spinward border, the Draconis Combine was looking to make its own gains. They had illicitly hired 20 bandit groups to keep their neighbours off balance, while they prepared their offensive. Minoru Kurita was planning an all-out assault on one of his two rival successor lords as a mean to demonstrate his own strength, and through it, Kurita's right to rule the Star League, though it was becoming increasingly unclear as to whether such a thing even existed anymore. He would make his decision based on a series of probing attacks, the first of which targeted House Steiner. In August 2785, Bone Norman was raided by a battalion of unmarked mechs, whose primary concern seemed to be causing as much damage as possible. Subsequent attacks by aerospace fighters in the Barcelona and Somerset systems raised the spectre of a resurgent Rimwell's Republic among Lyran High Command. Some speculated that the attacks, which had in truth been carried out by the Combine's Azami people, were Kuritan false flag operations, but Paul Steiner concluded that both aggressors would be just as likely to exploit a weakness along the periphery. As such, several regiments were redeployed to the Corwood border. The DCMS now struck, targeting the planets Gram and Trolloc Prime, overwhelming the planetary militia by December 2785. In the case of the latter, some 3,000 civilians caught in the crossfire found refuge within the local HPG station, an act of magnanimity that earned Blake's followers further acclaim. That same month, the Dieron regulars were making another assault on the planet Town, only this time their goal was to capture the planet. Their earlier raid had clued them in to how disorganized the planetary garrison was, and the mechs and 7 supporting infantry and aerospace regiments made short work of them. Reinforcements only arrived in February, by which time it was too late. On Terra, Jerome Blake was busy reinforcing his own tenuous position. The rest of the Inner Sphere was closing in on all sides, and it wouldn't be long before they reached humanity's homeworld. In December 2785, one of Blake's close friends from the latter days of the Civil War, Conrad Toyama, became the chief administrator for the SL Comnet Prime Circuit Station on Dieron. The network had come back online just 3 days after Kerensky's exodus. There was little doubt that he would not be returning, and so in the months that followed, the decision was made to rename the unwieldy and misrepresentative Starleague Department of Communications. At Toyama's urging, January 2786 saw the launch of the newly rebranded Comstar. The organization began by introducing the Comstar Letter of Credit, later inheriting the colloquial name C-Bill from the old Starleague dollar. The recovery efforts also continued, with one of the largest projects being the Comstar Space Debris Command, which was tasked with clearing the wreckage of many hundreds of warships and jumpships scattered throughout the hegemony. Officially, these hulks were all scrapped, but Blake concealed the existence of a rare few serviceable vessels. Curiously, no effort was made to reconstruct the orbital mirror over Venus, destroyed in a foolhardy maneuver by Amaris's goons. Over the next 2 centuries, the atmosphere slowly reverted back to its inhospitable state, with barely a few thousand left today inhabiting the former home of 200 million. Elsewhere in the Terran hegemony, several systems were taking matters of defense into their own hands. They could see the old state collapsing, but
200
wished to
million
retain their
people were
independence
on
from the larger
Venus.
nations around them.
Gone.
A fledgling alliance was formed in the Lone Star province, key among which were the systems of Dieron and Ingolsmund, containing the Stella Trek and LTV aerospace warship facilities. The unification of these planets under Ingolsmund came just in time to resist House Kirita's next thrust deep into the Lone Star province. The DCMS entered the region in early 2786, their objective to settle an old score dating back almost 500 years to before the Combine's founding, when Dieron split from the rest of the Alliance of Galadon, in protest of Shiro Kirita's double-dealing. The former hegemony worlds gave the Kiritans unexpected difficulties, however. The industrial output of these planets allowed them to field advanced battle mechs that at one time would have been exclusive to the SLDF Royal regiments. Furthermore, they had at least 2 warships of their own, with several more under construction. In March, the First Prince and his field marshals concluded that they would soon be at war with the Capellan state, and decided that a preemptive strike was preferable. They were still monitoring what appeared to be significant DCMS activity within the Galadon district on their Corwood flank, but the Department of Military Intelligence suggested that the Kiritans were more afraid of Kerensky returning than preparing to attack. Large chunks of the Davian armed forces relocated to the Liao border around the Chesterton worlds. That same month, Kenyon Maddox set about evening the score for Bolan and Denebola, beginning with an attack against Altoona. Nuclear weapons were used to eradicate the surviving battalion of Sky Rangers from Operation Elbow Joint. He followed that up with the takeover of the undefended Hornier's Keep in July. It seemed to the rest of the Inner Sphere that Minoru Kirita had decided which of his immediate foes would become the focus of their own upcoming campaign. In June, the Lyran defences at Skondia were caught completely unawares when a merchant vessel appeared in system and undocked with a sextet of dropships. They burned hard for the planet, whereupon half of them made landfall outside the major northern cities. The LCAF moved to protect the high-priority factories, but the attacking Kiritans had a different target in mind. They began instead to open fire on the civilian structures, intent on causing as much death and destruction as possible. The Arcturan guards naturally rushed to their aid, but this left the factories undefended. The second half of the Benjamin regulars now touched down at their actual objectives and raided the facilities, while the faster distraction force outpaced the heavier but slower Lyran machines to make it off-world with a minimum of casualties. The same could not be said for the Skondians, 20,000 of whom had been killed. By the midpoint of 2786, all of the border worlds formerly administered by the Star League had been taken over by one nation or another. Some of the Terran administrators were ushered out at gunpoint, others were wooed to lend their services to new masters. Remnants of the SLDF were either hired on or chased out, such as McKinnon's company on Kesai 4, who signed up with the Crucis Lancers after the Draconis Combine tried to eradicate them. The hegemony itself had continued to shrink. 2 of the former provincial capitals were now under foreign occupation. Jerome Blake could see that the so-called phony war was about to descend into something much worse. If he had any hope of protecting the core worlds, he would have to act fast. He outlined his plan to the Comstar First Circuit, the HPG administrators for each of the Prime Circuit stations. Preparations began for Operation Silver Shield. Trusted mercenary groups formed from ex-SLDF soldiers began relocating to Earth, while Blake himself departed to meet each of the successor lords. He sought recognition of Comstar's neutral status and assurances that the HPGs would not be targeted during any upcoming conflict. In a rimward direction, the Capellan Confederation moved to shore up their borders by sending the Zion Lancers to secure their homeworld after it had been taken by opportunistic Marek forces. They also cleared a path to the planet Northwind, home of the famous Northwind Highlanders, longtime mercenary auxiliaries for the Capellans. The Federated Sons likewise moved to take the home system of their Deneb-like cavalry. In December, the DCMS finally achieved their goal of reclaiming Dieron after its secession 475 years earlier. With the system under Draconis Combine rule, the Dieron regulars had at last secured a home for themselves, and a new military district was established. With this victory, Coordinator Minoru Kirita felt bold enough to make the announcement that each of the successor states were considering. He proclaimed himself First Lord of the Star League, and declared war on any who would challenge him. The succession wars had begun.
It's been well played.
When Minoru Kurita proclaimed himself First Lord in December 2786, it kicked off the largest conflict in human history. With so many players involved and such high stakes, it is worth dedicating a chapter of our story to covering the participants in detail. Much of this information remains relevant to the present day 3025, so laying out this foundational knowledge now will allow us to skip past it when covering later events. Chiefly, this will be an in-depth look at the political landscape of the Inner Sphere, focusing on the successor states in the year 2787, the size of their realm, their internal structure, industrial might, and the reputation of their intelligence agencies, as well as some comparisons between them. We'll also look in brief at some of the minor powers scattered across the Inner Sphere and periphery, as well as the remnants of the once mighty Star League and Amaris Empire. The following chapter will delve into the size and composition of their armies and navies. As mentioned, Minoru Kurita was the first to declare himself First Lord from his chrysanthemum throne on Luthien, so it makes sense to begin our overview with the Draconis Combine. The Coordinator of Worlds exercised an unparalleled level of control over their nation, leading a stratocracy of military leaders. Minor noble houses held considerably less sway in the Combine than in their neighbouring states. The Kuritan family claimed dominion over the third largest territory within the Inner Sphere, containing 404 planets, fewer than all but one of the rival Great Houses. The realm was divided into 5 military districts, each ruled by a warlord and internally subdivided into several prefectures. Of particular note was the warlord of the Galadon district, the Coordinator's son Jinjiro. Kuritan appointed governors often ran the day-to-day operations of the 5 government districts, but could be overruled on the whims of their warlord superiors. In the Draconis Combine, the military reigned supreme over all else. During the course of the war, the Combine would restructure itself as the Dieron military district was formed out of the captured hegemony worlds and the Benjamin prefectures closest to Terra. Chancellor Barbara Liao followed the Coordinator's pronouncement by declaring later that December that it was in fact she who was the new First Lord. House Liao already wielded near complete autocratic control over the lives of every citizen within the Capellan Confederation. However, they were kept in check by a small council known as the Prefectorate, and also maintained the facade of consulting the nobility through the House of Scions. The Confederation was notable for its very high density of colonized systems. The Liao family may have held the smallest territory of any great house, but they had fully exploited the systems within that area to claim control over 432 planets. The Capellan Confederation was made up of 7 commonalities, each a former nation that had banded together to fight off the predations of their larger neighbours back in the 24th century. The Jade Palace on Cyan gave that province overall supremacy, but the Capella, Sarna, St. Ives and Tikhonov commonalities were all historic members. The Andurian and Chesterton commonalities were disputed systems with their neighbours, and would become some of the most heavily contested worlds of the war. On New Year's Eve, Archon Jennifer Steiner called Kurita's bluff and declared herself First Lord. It was more out of mockery than a personal conviction, as Jennifer had long since accepted that the Star League was no more. Unlike the other realms, House Steiner had not ruled from the outset, instead taking power in the early years of the Age of War after moving the capital of the Lyran Commonwealth to their homeworld of Tharkad, constructing the Triad as the centre for all branches of government. Since then, they had consolidated power within the family as much as possible, but the Estates General still held a moderate degree of influence. The Steiner realm was the largest single territory within the Inner Sphere, containing 476 colonized planets. The Lyran Commonwealth had an antagonistic relationship with their Spinwood neighbour going back centuries. It was the threat of Curitan expansion that had actually drove the Protectorate of Donegal, Federation of Sky and Tamar Pact to unify. Each of the former states is subdivided into 4 provinces or shires, with the 3 capitals located within the District of Donegal, Isle of Skye and Tamar domains. The noble houses of Kelsois and Lestrade rule the Spinwood regions from Tamar and Skye. Viola Steiner Dinason's Day of Rage during the Reunification War would always cast a shadow over relations between the families, but the long years of prosperity had repaired most of the damage. Captain General Kenyon Marek followed his neighbour's example by declaring himself First Lord in January 2787. The Free Worlds League was a loose conglomeration of independent worlds, several among which had unified into one of many provinces. Representatives met within the Parliament on Atreus to elect a council to handle matters of state. While the ministers themselves were often unelected nobles within their own systems, this still gave the League a notable democratic bent in comparison to its rivals. However, all this was thrown into jeopardy with the passing of Resolution 288. The position of Captain General was envisioned as only being used in times of great crisis to ensure the nation could defend itself. But now, as long as House Marek continued to claim that said crisis existed, they could rule as a virtual dictator. Territorially, Kenyon's realm was larger only than the Capellan Confederation, but they were sparsely populated by comparison, controlling just 338 planets. The 3 major powers within the Free Worlds League were the Grand Duchy of Orient, the Principality of Regulus, and the Marek Commonwealth, within which was the nation's capital. They were ruled by the noble houses Allison, Cameron Jones, and Marek. Additionally, the Stuart Commonalty of House Stuart and Duchy of Andurian of House Humphreys also held a reasonable amount of power. Furthermore, many smaller provinces existed, including the Abbey District, Duchies of Graham Marek, Kalidasa, and Orloff, Principality of Gibson, Regulum Free States, and Rim Commonalty. Lastly, there was the Bowl and Thumb, a pseudo-province jutting into the Lyran Commonwealth. The Salient was not a formally recognised province, despite raising a brigade from its own populace. In practice, the region was run by the League's Central Coordination and Command Group. Last to throw his hat into the ring was First Prince John Davian. The others had made it abundantly clear that they would not support him as First Lord, despite his position as Regent. Only Minoru Kurita could have corroborated his appointment, as he had received a missive from Richard Cameron on the matter, though for obvious reasons he chose not to speak up. Of all the rulers, the First Prince held the least amount of power within their respective realm, at least as long as Resolution 288 held. Their actions in many areas could be impeded or even countermanded by the High Council, an authority which the Davians had continually chipped away at over the centuries. The Federated Suns, territorially second only to the Lyran Commonwealth and counting the greatest number of colonized planets within its borders at 538, relied heavily on the system of feudalism to exercise control over such a large state. Barons holding small regions of land paid homage to the counts that ruled the planets, who in turn swore fealty to the dukes who controlled whole regions of space, all of whom served the First Prince. The Federated Suns was not an alliance of smaller nations. It grew from the Crucis Pact signed on New Avalon during the 24th century, slowly absorbing independent worlds and microstates as it went. Following the Davian Civil War, the internal borders were redrawn and the realms divided into 3 marches, the Draconis and Capellan facing their respective neighbours, and the Crucis March at the centre. The marches were split into 2 or 3 operational areas, and then subdivided into combat regions. Control of the Draconis March had rested with House Sandoval and Robinson for over 2 centuries, while the powerful Hassic family of New Syrtis had de facto command of the Capellan border. The Terran hegemony may have survived the Amaris Empire in body, but not in spirit. The remains of the Cameron realm were in poor shape, now amounting to just 72 systems. President of the Terran Congress and de facto Director General was Jens Penera. At well over 100 years old, he struggled to lead a nation in ruins, lacking even the most basic support to get things done. Their authority was further undermined by the growing influence of Comstar on Earth. The provincial capitals of Terra Firma and Tirfing had been seized by the Capellan Confederation and Free Worlds League, forcing the administrative centres to relocate to Brownsville and New Dallas. Lone Star Province was theoretically run from its namesake system, but the planet was still reeling from the fallout of the Starleague Civil War. Several worlds had broken off to form their own proto-state around Inglesmond. Lockdale Province, like the other three outer regions, had lost half its territory to its expansionist neighbours. Even the hegemony core was being nibbled at by the Lyran Commonwealth. The military-industrial complex within the Inner Sphere had been steadily ramping up for decades, and soon each nation would be funneling all available resources into wartime production. While certain regions were particularly known for being heavily industrialized, such as the Federation of Sky and Tikhonov commonality, the major arms factories were often situated away from these vulnerable border regions, deeper into secure territory. This was just as well, as they would soon become primary objectives for raids once the war commenced. Many of these key installations were located at national or regional capitals, which were themselves priority targets for capture or destruction. The Draconis Combine had most of its major factory worlds located within the Pesht military district, accounting for almost as many as the others combined. Chief among these was the planet sometimes known as Black Luthien, so named for the polluted grey sky that permanently hangs above the capital's massive industrial complexes. The Combine was notably lagging behind their rivals, producing approximately 20% less than the standard of the day. Liao's industrial might was relatively decentralized. The 5 older Capellan commonalities maintained a rough balance between themselves, while the fractured Andurian had less to offer and the Chesterton worlds virtually nothing. The Confederation's industrial capital was the planet Tikhonov, the sole planet to have resisted Amaris's early aggression during the Starleague Civil War. Within the Lyran Commonwealth, the expansive Protectorate of Donegal produced more than half of Steiner's weapons, despite most of the province being undeveloped in comparison to their Spinwood compatriots. The key industrial site was located on Hesperus II, the largest manufacturer of battle mechs in existence. Overall production for the realm was more than 30% greater than their nearest rivals, making them a serious threat in a protracted war. In a realm known for bickering and political infighting, House Manic was wise to keep most of their weapons production within their own commonwealth. A few notable League independents also made significant contributions equivalent to some of the much larger provinces. The largest factories were on Irian. This planet generated so much wealth that in the modern era it now exists as a one-world province of its own, still matching even the Grand Duchy of Orient single-handedly. Within the Federated Suns, House Hassett could produce nearly 3 times House Sandoval, but could only manage half of what came out of the much larger Crucis March. New Avalon housed the largest factories, matching Luthien in terms of weapons manufacturing. Overall production for the realm was equal to the Capellans and Freewelders. Lastly, the battered Terran hegemony had surviving weapons plants on only New Earth and Terra itself. Despite the 3-year battle that had raged across its surface, enough factories had survived the carnage at the end of the Starleague Civil War to match the Davian and Kurita capitals for most heavily industrialized planets in human space. Just as critical to the war effort as these ground factories were the rare few naval yards capable of constructing and servicing warships. Historically, the Terran hegemony had been the center of warship production in the Inner Sphere. Many designs in service with the successor state navies originated in the hegemony, making its capture essential to maintaining their fleets. Even in its fractured state, it still operated 14 military-grade shipyards, more than any great house. 8 of the Draconis Combine's 10 facilities were in the Pesht military district. The Capellans had 1 fewer in total, again spread across their realm. Sky and Donegal were nearly matched, with a 10th Lyran shipyard in the Tamar Pact, and the Free Worlds League had 11, with a notable concentration within the small Principality of Gibson. The Federated Suns had just 9, again based mostly in the Cruisers Pact. However, a third of their theoretical outputs came from the Galax Megaplex, a massive new naval yard constructed by Boeing International after the fall of the Star League. Problematically, they refused to begin production until they received orders from head office on Terra. This left House Davian with only 6 operating facilities.
Of course Boeing would do that.
Throughout the Succession Wars, the success or failure of a plan often rested on the abilities of a nation's intelligence agency. The most ruthless and pervasive is surely the internal security force of the Draconis Combine. They answered directly to the Coordinator, meaning even the most powerful warlords had to fear the ISF agents doubtless hidden within their staff or household. A second group within the Combine was the Order of the Five Pillars. Officially tasked with simply maintaining the honour of House Kurita, they operated their own network of spies all the same. Perhaps only one was more feared than the ISF, and that was the Mashkarovka of the Capellan state. They had a history of using terror tactics to achieve their goals. The Lyran Intelligence Corps employed some of the best minds within the Commonwealth. In contrast to their military, the LIC was extremely well run and effective. In a realm not known for fanaticism, the Intelligence Corps nevertheless employed some of the most die-hard loyalists. The newest intelligence agency belonged to the Free Worlds League. SAFE was founded after its predecessor, the National Intelligence Agency, was disbanded in the wake of a financial scandal. Their involvement in the Matic Civil War had tarnished their name, and often they struggled to achieve the same results as their neighbours. The Federated Suns was without a civilian agency, instead relying solely on the Armed Forces Department of Military Intelligence. Unfortunately, internal factionalism and elitism on the part of the military meant that crucial information often wasn't shared with others who might have benefited from it. The periphery states would barely participate in the First Succession War. They wisely distanced themselves from the conflagration, but were not without difficulties of their own. Their hard-won independence had come with a slew of problems that the battered realms still struggling to rebuild after their freedom war had trouble dealing with. Protector Nicoletta Calderon had achieved her life ambition in gaining independence for the Taurian Concordat. Her family's holdings had grown to include 77 planets, stretched along the Federated Sun's rimward border. The realm was divided into the Brinton, Damasus, Hades, and Perdition unions, but the nation's heart remained within the fortified Flanagan's Nebula and the planet Taurus within. Most of the Taurians' manufacturing, both weapons factories and their 3 warship facilities, took place in the Hades and Perdition unions. Equivalent to less than 30% of the Inner Sphere average, they nonetheless managed to outperform what was left of the Terran hegemony. Magistrix Janina Centrella still sat on the throne of Canopus, ruler of some 65 planets. The magistracy had managed to escape the worst of the carnage during the reunification war that brought them into the Star League, but winning their independence had cost the realm dearly. First hit had been the Canopus district, but the Ballad and Luxon provinces had seen fierce fighting in the second year. House Centrella had only 2 major manufacturing worlds, at Canopus and Dunianshire. This accounted for not even a quarter of the Taurian output. Those planets also maintained naval yards in orbit. The 137 planets of the Outworlds Alliance were notionally helmed by President David Avalar from Alpharats, but the naturally isolationist citizens of the Outworlds only paid lip service to their supposed ruler. Alongside the capital province were the Balagora, Blomstein, Cerberus, Omferwacht, and Remora provinces, as well as the Traders' Domain. Just as the others were, the Outworlds was suffering from the fallout of the Periphery Uprising. The nation could just about match the magistracy for arms production, but had just a single major shipyard, dangerously close to their 2 aggressive neighbours. The Rimworld's Republic had been one of the casualties of Alexander Kerensky's inexorable advance during the Star League Civil War. The older Manus government had been removed at gunpoint, and the fragile democracy that replaced it was swept aside during Operation Ulmerich by the Lyran Commonwealth, who went on to seize most of the key industrial worlds for themselves. Without that foundation, the realm had collapsed. Within this lawless region, various pirate groups and petty kings staked their claim to the ruins. The Barony of Strang and Belt Pirates of Star's End were two such groups, based around systems containing rare periphery naval yards. The Black
Star's End
Warriors,
is a
the
very,
mercenaries
very
that had
special
played
topic.
an instrumental
Might do a
part in the
video on that at
liberation
some
of the
point.
Terran hegemony through their training efforts at Camp Amber, had been abandoned by the SLDF. When some Lyran refugees arrived in 2785, together they formed the Cercinus Federation. Outwardly, they put on the appearances of a periphery independent, but in truth, they were bandits for hire. Largest and oldest of these pirate realms were the Tortuga Dominions, a loose collection of outlaw groups situated on the far side of the Inner Sphere. Out of the ashes of the Republic rose two realms that promised some better hope of unifying and rebuilding the region. First came the Oberon Confederation in 2775, and then the Finnmark Free Republic 4 years later, the latter even capable of warship production. In a rimward direction were two more periphery microstates, the Illyrian Palatinate and Lothian League. In the deep periphery was one other minor compact, known as the Yarnfolk. They had very few dealings with the Star League, and are so remote they have not been heard from in the 250 years since its fall. This was the state of the Inner Sphere in 2787.
Okay.
The successor states girding for war couldn't have known it, but this was to be the apex of their civilization. Would any of the successor lords have reconsidered if they knew how little they stood to gain, and how much their own realms were about to suffer?
Yeah, they still would have done it. Let's be fair. Let's be very fair. They would have absolutely killed each other regardless.
When Alexander Kerensky departed for uncharted space in November 2784, he did so with a force of well over 2 million soldiers. Yet even this was just a fraction of the total number of individuals who had fought in the Star League Civil War. If one includes the Periphery Uprising, a total of around 5,500 regiments had participated across both sides. While no individual successor state could come close to matching the mighty Star League Defense Force, together they would far surpass it. The First Succession War would see more than 7,500 regiments do battle. The successor state militaries were at their peak, each commanding between 12 and 1,700 regiments apiece. Never again would they reach the heights that they did in 2787. More than 2 centuries of war have steadily reduced those numbers. The high watermark for warships had passed along with the Star League Navy. Only 1,000 such vessels were left in the Inner Sphere, compared to the more than 3,000 Amaris and Kerensky had hurled at each other. From the moment the Star League Accords were ratified in 2571, the Great Houses were constrained on how much of their resources could be funneled into the military. Directive 30, passed in 2650, further reduced the size of the standing armies. Unfortunately, the good years were already coming to a close by that point, and with the commencement of several hidden wars and civil unrest, each member state of the Star League sought ways to circumvent the restrictions. When the Council Edict of 2650 was revoked a century later following the assassination of Simon Cameron, the size of the House militaries grew rapidly. In truth, most of that early expansion was nothing more than officially acknowledging the reality that each had vast numbers of demobilized troops that could be called upon to fight. Between 2750 and the beginning of the Periphery Uprising 15 years later, the member state militaries saw an increase in size of between 55 and 120%. Throughout the Star League Civil War, every nation had made vast profits selling their military hardware to the desperate SLDF. Naturally, growth tapered off during this period, but the realms could see the growing importance of maintaining fleets of warships. The next 15 years saw them double the size of their navies by returning to service their many mothballed ships, as well as launching dozens of new vessels. With Amaris defeated, they pumped up production again for their own armies, but the looming threat of an irate Kerensky kept any from being as aggressive as they had during the years of Richard Cameron. But almost 200 more warships entered service in the 5 years that followed. Even before the Exodus, the Great Houses had made efforts to court surviving SLDF and Imperial forces in the hopes that they would switch sides. It was one of the leading reasons why Kerensky ultimately decided to lead his army into the deep periphery, to keep it out of the reach of the grasping successor lords. Around 78% of the defence force followed him, but that still left dozens of regiments lingering within the ruins of the Star League. Most of those left behind either entered service with their planetary militia or swore loyalty to Jerome Blake and Comstar, something which Blake did his best to cover up. But many others were swayed by one of the lucrative offers made by the successor states. Several turned mercenary and hired themselves out to the highest bidder. Some sat idle but ready, waiting to see if their comrades would return from deep space. While the passing of the Star League Defence Force marked the end of such large formations as divisions, corps, and armies, the successor states continued to use the same SLDF structure, where a lance was 4 battle mechs, a company 3 lances, a battalion 3 companies, and a regiment 3 battalions. Regiments of shared lineage or loyalty belonged to less defined brigades. At the onset of the First Succession War, these units were at optimum readiness levels, fully equipped with all the supplies and material they could wish for. It would be the last time this was ever the case. House Kurita's military was the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery. Like all of the warring parties, the DCMS in 2787 was at its apex, unmatched in size before or since. 146 battlemech regiments were available to Mechwarrior Kurita and his warlords, supported by almost 1,400 conventional regiments of infantry, armour, artillery, and aerospace fighters. At the top step of the DCMS were the 5 Sword of Light regiments, named for one of the 5 pillars of Kuritan society, those being ivory, steel, jade, gold, and teak. They were the personal command of the coordinator and tasked only with the most crucial objectives. Unsurprisingly, they were the best equipped forces in the Combine, each regiment fielding 4 battalions of cracked Mechwarriors, plus 2 wings of aerospace support. Beneath them were the military district units, representing Benjamin, Dieron, Galadin, Pesht, and Rosalhaig. The Galadin regulars were the best equipped of these, chiefly because of Jinjiro Kurita, but also because the ancestral home of House Kurita at New Samarkand was within their borders. Smaller units included the Arkab Legion, founded and operated by the semi-autonomous Azami people, and the Proserpina Hussars, a well-trained and respected free-floating unit deployed across the realm as needed. The Sunzang Academy was the Combine's premier military school, supplying the mustered soldiery with a dozen regiments of its own graduates, green but fanatically loyal. DCMS organisational doctrine at the time grouped each mech regiment into brigades alongside varying amounts of conventional forces, with the exception of the Sword of Light and Sunzang Academy cadre. Barbara Liao intended to use the Capellan Confederation armed forces to press her claim to the First Lordship. The CCAF, as had been the case throughout their history, was the smallest of the 5 successor state militaries, operating 118 battlemech regiments and another 1,100 conventional units. Of particular note was the Confederation's doctrinal reliance on artillery, averaging around twice as many battalions compared to the other successor states. The Chancellor is the highest authority within the armed forces, advised by the Strategios. The CCAF is less homogeneous in its structure, with several of the brigades broken into smaller subcommands or grouping dissimilar regiments. The Capellan Hussars were the best the state could field, but the individual units had a diverse range of backgrounds, many dating back to the old proto-states. Cyan's Red Lancers are the Chancellor's personal bodyguard, while Capella's Prefectorate Guard do the same for the ruling prefects. The Ares Titans are Capella's other elite unit. The Chesterton Guardians belong to their namesake commonality, Griff's Hussars St. Ives, and Blandford's Grenadiers Tikhonov. 2 of the Confederation's linchpin worlds also warrant a permanent garrison in the form of the Marshals of Tikhonov and Andurian Heavy Guard. To review the standardized brigades next, the Andurian Hussars, Capellan Chargers, Cyan Dragoons, and Tikhonov Lancers were maintained by their respective commonalities. the former Sana supremacy had a rebellious history, their old ignominious Sana sabres since replaced by the Liao Lancers. The Liao Guards were the personal brigade of the ruling family, while the Confederation Reserve Cavalry acted as the last line of defence. The Chesterton Regulars were as fractured as their home province. The Chesterton Cavalry and Cuirassiers are the only survivors of the old Chesterton Trading League army. The Ariana Fusiliers are another unit dating to before the Age of War, while the Ariana Grenadiers are a more recent addition. Shadrach's Shadowhawks and Tristram's Avengers complete the regulars. The St. Ives Armoured Cavalry is even more decentralised. The St. Ives Lancers are the lead unit, while the Chevaux Légers operate further across the Confederation. The Capellan Cuirassiers are one of the Commonalty's elite regiments, but are recruited from across the realm. The Centauri Guards are an amalgamation of several older noble house units, while the Teng Hussars represent another but have remained a separate entity. The Redfield Renegades and Sharp Rifles have been raised by the respective homeworlds to bolster their defence. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces going into 2787 were the largest successor state military there has ever been. While the 120 battlemech regiments they fielded had them at a slight deficit compared to the DCMS, the number of armoured and infantry units in their ranks were vast, amounting to more than 1,550 additional regiments, totalling just under 1,700. Unlike the other realms where the successor lords had complete authority over the military, for the Lyrans, General of the Armies Paul Steiner, Yarkon's younger brother, was in command. When the war commenced, he took personal control over the Curitan Theatre and delegated the League border to General Amanda Lestrade. The 4 Royal Guard regiments were the best equipped and most loyal troops in the Commonwealth. Most of the LCAF belonged to one of 5 large brigades, the most massive of which was the Lyran Guards, maintaining 35 regiments split across 5 divisions. Despite their organisation, this grouping was purely for administrative reasons, as these units had no experience fighting at anything greater than regimental level. Other similarly large brigades included the Arcturan Guards, Donegal Guards, and Sky Rangers. The former officially remains a federal unit, founded to celebrate the union of the 3 nations and being the first to draw on soldiers from across the realm, but over the years it has become increasingly linked with the Tamar Pact. The size of the LCAF brigades makes it challenging to say which were best, with individual regiments varying massively in both experience and loyalty. The Lyran Regulars were another large unit, notably less prestigious than their Guards counterpart, but often performing better on the field. Several smaller brigades were founded by wealthy planets and nobility, recruiting heavily from those systems. These include the Donegal, Odessa, Sakhalin, and York Regulars, the Hesperus Guards, and the Tamar Hussars. While the Free Worlds League military was not the powerhouse it had been at the formation of the Star League, it was still sufficiently strong to see off their neighbours. In total, they had 117 battlemech regiments, plus another 1,400 assorted conventional ones. An ever-present hurdle for the Mariks when bringing their might to bear was to secure the support of the provincial forces. As shown during the Third Hidden War, if any duchy or principality withheld their troops, it could spell disaster for the Captain General. Of the federal forces, the Free Worlds Guards and Atrian Dragoons were the best supplied and most fanatical in their loyalty. The former had all been reinforced with a 4th Battalion. The largest brigade within the FWLM, and indeed the entire Inner Sphere, was the Marik Militia, numbering 40 regiments until the loss of the 34th during the Phony War. They varied significantly in experience, and were most often tasked with providing protection to the many independent worlds, or ensuring the supremacy of the Captain General over the smaller provinces by maintaining a garrison within their borders. Occupying a middle ground between the federal and provincial forces were the Bolan Defenders. At the top of the provincial forces were the Fusiliers of Orient and their vassal states Orloff Grenadiers. The incredible wealth available to the Grand Duchy meant these two were better equipped than even the best federal units. The former were organised into 4 combined arms brigades along old Star League lines, plus a 5th Ducal Guard regiment. House Allison heaped all its love and attention on the Fusiliers, leaving the Orient Hussars to pick up the scraps. Their counterparts in the other 2 major provinces were the Marik Guard and Regulan Hussars. The Stuart Dragoons continued to operate as a de facto federal brigade, Earl David Stuart ceding control to the Captain General during the Third Hidden War. The primary offensive force of this small province was the Juggernaut Regiment, the defence left to the Home Guard. Other planets within the commonalty raised their own units, the Helm Cuirassiers and Tania Dragoons. The defenders of Andurian were responsible for protecting what was left of the fractured Andurian duchy from Capellan aggression. Lastly, the Iron Guards were formed from the former hegemony worlds that had willingly sided with the Free Worlds League. The armed forces of the Federated Suns was one of the smaller militaries overall, but had a higher percentage of battle mechs, 132 mech regiments to more than 1,250 conventional. The AFFS had a well-organised structure on the surface, but suffered from factionalism and a provincial attitude that would cost them dearly during the war. Each march fielded an offensive brigade and a defensive march militia. A dozen smaller brigades assisted them where needed, at least in theory. Perhaps the most elite and loyal unit in existence, the Davian Brigade of Guards was the very best the ruling house could call upon. They trained extensively in combined arms operations, allowing them to make full use of their permanently assigned infantry, armour and aerospace assets. One step down, but still more than a match for most opponents on the field, were the Avalon Hussars. While they hailed from the Crucis March, it seemed extraordinarily unlikely that any aggressor would ever penetrate that far, and so in practice were scattered all across the realm. The entire brigade had been reinforced during the build-up, each regiment fielding 4 battalions apiece. The Robinson Chevaliers and Certis Fusiliers were each named for their respective march capitals, with at least 20 regiments each positioned along their border. Additionally, each march capital also raised a force purely from that one planet's population, known as the Robinson Rangers, Certis Hussars, and New Avalon Borderers. 2 other worlds that did the same form the Argyle Lancers and Clovis Guards. The Arcadian Cuirassiers were raised from the Chesterton worlds that fell on the Davian side of the border. The Seti Hussars were a combined arms brigade modelled on Star League Light Horse regiments. The Dragon Lords came into existence during the Reunification War as a quick response force to combat any Taurian incursions. The Tancredi Loyalists were built around the units who had abandoned Laura Davian during the nation's civil war and sided with the future First Prince. Many of the former Star League Defence Force personnel that had decided to remain in the Inner Sphere signed on with one of the successor states, but the AFFS alone organised most of its SLDF recruits into their own units, the first among which would use their expertise to train new regiments in Star League doctrine. The Crucis Lancers was an old disbanded brigade brought back into service after the Exodus, and has since become one of their most celebrated. 2 regiments were still in training at the war's outset, but would enter service within the year. The Deneb Light Cavalry were the remains of a joint Star League Fed Suns venture known as the Rapid Deployment Mixed Armed Forces. Their regiments were primarily raised from the Davian member state, and those who didn't depart on the Exodus soon went over. The final element of the armed forces were the Capellan, Crucis and Draconis March Militias. Devised by John Davian as a way to turn the best of his planetary garrisons into a more mobile force, these large combined arms units added considerable strength to the AFFS on paper, but it meant that each combat region had most of its strength focused in just a handful of systems. Most planets no longer fielded their own militias, leaving them vulnerable to a sudden incursion. In terms of sheer numbers, the 5 successor states were relatively even. Each had a realistic shot at coming out on top. Quantity is just one half of the equation, however. Looking at the quality of those troops allows us to note some important facts. The AFFS, DCMS and LCAF had the highest percentage of veterans and elites, whereas their counterparts in the CCAF and FWLM were slightly lacking. Less than a quarter of the Fed Suns and Lyran forces were green recruits, whereas around a third of the other realms' militaries were down on experience. On the surface then, House Davian and Steiner were looking strong, but there is another side to the coin. As previously noted, the Federated Suns forces were individually loyal to the First Prince, but struggled to cooperate with their immediate neighbours. The Lyrans had the fewest number of fanatics within their military. This in itself was not a problem, but both they and the Capellans had significant numbers of troops with questionable loyalties, around a third of their respective armed forces, compared to a quarter of the Draconis Combine and Free Worlds League, and just 15% of the AFFS. This had the potential to be disastrous if their soldiers started questioning the competency of their leaders, or if one of the regional blocks decided to break away. Fleet actions would play an integral part in the First Succession War. The monstrously powerful naval-grade weapons could obliterate entire regiments in mere minutes, but any orbital strike would rely first on securing the system, or at least the local space in orbit above a world. The enormous Star League Navy had passed into legend. Of the more than 2,000 warships that cleared a path through the hegemony, just 12 had remained behind. These were hidden by Comstar within the Terran system, their presence kept secret from the successor states. Many Age of War era Terran hegemony designs were in widespread use with the successor state navies. These include the Vincent-class corvette, Essex and Lola-class destroyers, and Aegis-class cruiser, as well as a few less common designs. A few Star League era designs were also dotted about, including later refits of those classes just mentioned, and a few dozen Cadet-class transports, but also a rare few heavy cruisers. The Draconis Combine Admiralty began the conflict with 8 fleets, 2 from each of the established military districts. This accounted for a total of 197 warships, plus a pair of corvettes permanently attached to the 1st Proserpina Hussars. The DCA crews were particularly skilled compared to their contemporaries, having conducted regular training exercises for the Star League Navy. As well as the older Terran-derived designs, the Combine fielded 2 of its own. The Narukami-class destroyer is on par with the best the Star League had to offer. A swift ship with a heavy weapons complement for its size, Narukamis can be found in every fleet. The Samarkand-class light carrier was primarily a support vessel, transporting 3 dozen aerospace fighters each. They were a powerful force multiplier, but performed poorly without support due to a lack of firepower and armour. The Capellan Confederation Navy, like their ground-based counterpart, was the smallest of the 5 successor states at just 157 warships. A significant percentage of those were also older designs, whether Terran or homegrown. Each of the 5 major commonalities maintains a fleet of their own, while a reserve fleet packs the heaviest punch, moving to whichever front is most in need of the additional firepower. 2 designs of note have come out of the Capellan Confederation. The newest is the enormous Soil-class heavy cruiser, weighing in at 1.5 million tons. This vessel is built around a single party piece, the capital-grade mass driver. It is a challenging weapon to use, as it requires the entire ship to be aimed directly at their target, but if it lands a hit, the mass driver has the potential to obliterate another warship in a single blast. Before the conflict erupted, the Free Worlds League had purchased several Soils from their rivals at exorbitant prices. The older design is the Dushiwan-class battlecruiser. This vessel actually originates within the long-defunct Duchy of Liao, and was the very first constructed by the new Confederation. Its all-energy weapon loadout allows it to operate for extended periods without resupply. The largest fleets remaining within the Inner Sphere belong to the Lyran Commonwealth, which possess 217 warships. Each of the 3 states within the Commonwealth fields a pair of fleets and another squadron in orbit above their capital. The Lyrans employ a trio of distinctive designs throughout their navy. The newest and most numerous is the Mako-class corvette. One of the best ships in its class, matching any produced by the Star League, the Mako has both the speed of a corvette and the weapons and armour to match even a small destroyer. The Commonwealth-class light cruiser is an older design, put back into production with new upgraded components. It has become a staple of the realm's naval defence. The largest ship employed by House Steiner is the Tharkad class. Despite being 4.5 times the size, it can match the speed of the Mako, but carries a far larger weapons load. The Free Worlds League as a whole maintains a federal navy, but so too do 3 of the provinces, Andurian, Orient, and Regulus. Altogether, they can field 159 warships. The FWLN is split into 5 fleets, the 1st through 5th based at Judone, Orient, Kanata, Tamarind, and Gibraltar. The skills of the crews across the various federal and provincial forces are fairly standard, but the Andurian Squadron is notably reluctant to cooperate with the Captain General, much like their compatriots within the Defenders of Andurian. Two vessels define the Free World's navy. The first is the League-class destroyer. The design originated way back in the 24th century, but all of these older vessels have since been decommissioned or destroyed, the last during the Third Hidden War. An updated League class entered service much more recently with several key improvements. Twice its size, weighing in at 1.1 million tons, is the Atreus class battleship. When the class entered service shortly before the Reunification War, it outperformed anything fielded by the Terran hegemony or nascent Star League. Centuries of development have made it lose some of its luster, but it's still an effective and deadly opponent. Last of all is the Federated Suns Navy, which operated 184 warships in 2787. These are divided into 4 fleets: the Coreward Fleet facing the Capellan Confederation, the Spinward Fleet towards the Draconis Combine, the Rimward Fleet dealing with the Taurian Concordat and rest of the periphery border, and the Crucis Fleet acting as a mobile reserve. House Davian has 4 ship classes unique to its navy. The Robinson-class transport and Eucertus-class carrier were 2 vessels born in the turbulent times following the Davian Civil War. First Prince Alexander hoped these new classes would help bind the remnants of the old federated peacekeeping forces from the fractured marches together and give them regional pride within the then new AFFS. The Davian-class destroyer went through 2 iterations. While the first was somewhat of a disappointment considering the name it bore, the evolution showed considerably more promise. The largest vessel in their navy was the ancient but still capable Defender-class battlecruiser. Among its number was the flagship of the entire navy, the FSS Golden Lion. Besides the successor states, a few other minor powers also participated in the First Succession War. The hegemony armed forces, such as they were, consisted of those SLDF units who had not followed Kerensky on his exodus. In total, 17 divisions and a further 16 independent regiments had stayed behind. Theoretically, this amounted to 85 battlemech and 84 infantry regiments, but all of those had suffered heavy losses during the Star League Civil War, and so their actual strength was a mere fraction of that. The vast majority were located within the hegemony core, but further afield were other remnants of the Star League, still camped at their final duty stations. The most notable of these was the Eredani Lighthorse on Trondheim, who would hold vigil on the world as they waited to see if Kerensky would return. The former territorial states were cautious about becoming dragged into the looming succession war and remained on the defensive for the rest of the 28th century. The Taurian Defence Force, while remaining officially neutral in the so-called Freedom War, had nonetheless suffered significant losses during the uprising. The TDF in 2787 fielded just 7 mech regiments and 63 conventional. 1st, 2nd and 4th Corps had been completely wiped out participating in the Freedom War, and only the Pleiades Hussars had survived from the 3rd. 3 new regiments had been raised which went some way to replacing those losses: the Concordat Cuirassiers, Concordat Jaegers and the Red Chasseurs. The Taurian Guard Corps, consisting of the Concordat Commandos, Taurian Guards and Taurian Velites, had remained within the Hades cluster and so had not been touched by the conflict. The Concordat Navy was the only periphery fleet to have surviving warships, TCS Parin and Vandenberg, both hidden deep inside Flanagan's Nebula. The Magistracy Armed Forces mirrored their counterparts in the TDF, 7 battlemech and 63 conventional regiments. Freedom War losses had cost the Magistracy Royal Guard the 2nd Canopian Cuirassiers, the Chasseurs à Cheval had lost the 3rd Canopian Light Horse, and the Canopian Fusiliers were down their 4th Regiment. The People's Volunteers Brigade had been devastated. None had survived to see independence. Reventhar's Iron Hand was the only new unit formed in the intervening years. The Alliance Military Corps was now a scant 3 battlemech regiments, plus another 25 of infantry, armour and artillery. Notably, AMC doctrine called for a greater reliance on aerospace fighters, mostly because mechs were symbolically tied to the atrocities committed by Amos Forlow during the Reunification War, and the Alliance maintained around 10 regiments worth. all of the Alliance military corps had been involved in the Freedom War to some degree, the survivors organised into completely new units. The Alphanats Guards protected the capital and ruling Avalar family, the Alliance Grenadiers were stationed on the key industrial world of Lushan, and the Balagora Defenders were formed out of what remained of the old Fusiliers Brigade. The only other periphery nation to have anything more than planetary militia was the new Finnmark Free Republic. Based around a one-time provincial capital of the Rimwell's Republic, they were able to field a standing army of 2 mech regiments and a dozen more conventional ones. The other microstates had never acquired a military of their own, but the increase in piracy, particularly from the neighbouring Cercinus Federation, meant that small mercenary groups could find regular employment with them. The Starleague Civil War had shown that mercenaries would be an essential part of any future conflict. Whereas before the successor states had been content for local governments or nobility to hire small bands as needed, now they sought out the ever-increasing number of regiments forming from both the SLDF remnants and the soldiers of the Amaris Empire as they were released from POW camps. An exhaustive list of every one of them would take too long, but a few of the larger groups are worth mentioning. The Northwind Highlanders had first entered into a long-term contract with the Capellan Confederation in 2365, and had at least one of their 6 regiments serving alongside the SECAF for over 400 years. They were the largest merc unit to have survived the fall of the Starleague. The Stalingrad Division had remained in the Inner Sphere, accepting a contract with the Federated Sons. The surviving 5 regiments formed the Screaming Eagles. The Elysian Lancers had at one time been the largest of all mercenary groups, but the Civil War had seen 5 of their regiments disbanded. Now they served the Lyran Commonwealth. The Always Faithful were a brand new unit in service to the Confederation, with an unusual story. The 3 regiments were formed from veterans of the Starleague Civil War, but notably consisted of soldiers from both sides of the conflict. The Blue Star Regulars were another of similar background. 2 of the 3 regiments were led by recipients of Kerensky's Blue Star Medal, while the other one once fought for Amaris. Now they fought for Davian. The Lexington Combat Group were once 3 SLDF independent regiments stationed within either the Outworlds Alliance or Magistracy of Canopus, miraculously surviving both the Uprising and Terran campaign. They also signed on with the Federated Sons. The Gravewalkers were an ancient mercenary unit consisting of 2 regiments. Their history goes further back than any other, their origins lost to time. They had found a home for themselves in the Magistracy of Canopus, though they were not yet employed by House Centrella. The 12-Star Guard were another demi-brigade of former SLDF regiments in service to Liao. Of the 5 successor states, the Federated Sons was the largest employer, positioning its 13 regiments and pair of battalions along the Capellan border. The Confederation had most of their 13 regiments deployed to face them. The Draconis Combine and Lyran Commonwealth had 7 regiments each, plus another battalion-sized unit, all of which they deployed to just one of their borders. The Free Worlds League was sorely lacking, having hired only Gladstone's gladiators. A handful of other mercenaries were scattered around the periphery, though none had yet found employment with those nations. The First Succession War would see a new type of brutality unleashed on the Inner Sphere. Throughout the Age of War, conflicts were governed by the Ares Conventions. Though not without their problems, they did help to reduce civilian casualties. When they were rescinded at the onset of the Reunification War, it became acceptable to slaughter tens of thousands as long as the military objective was accomplished. The Starleague Civil War had seen the Amaris Empire use entire cities as human shields, or deliberate destruction of whole populations to create humanitarian disasters that would slow Kerensky's advance. Very quickly, the military leaders of the successor states determined that in the First Succession War, the extermination of cities would become the objective itself. The death toll would soon reach apocalyptic levels. The stage was set, troops were in place, intentions declared. Now everyone waited to see who would make the first move.
God damn! Guess we're gonna have a genocide.
At the dawn of 2787, the doomsday clock was at 1 minute to midnight. The successor states had declared war on each other. All travel and interstate commerce had ground to a halt. The people of the Inner Sphere were frozen in terror, waiting to see where the first strike would land. As yet, no one had made a move, but behind the scenes, each nation was scrambling to be the first to launch a knockout blow before they themselves were attacked. While the last of the successor lords were claiming rulership of the Star League, Jerome Blake arrived on Tharkad to meet with the Archon. He explained to her his desire to see Comstar recognized as a neutral party. In return, he would continue to operate the HPG network within the Commonwealth, allowing them to pass messages between themselves and to neighbouring states. Seizing the facilities was always an option available to Jennifer Steiner. She, like each of her rivals, had in her navy a small number of individuals who were qualified to operate the exceedingly rare mobile HPGs, a technology that had now all but vanished along with the rest of the SLDF. But it would take time to train a whole new workforce to take over the hyperpulse generators, time which she could scarcely afford to lose at this crucial hour. Having experienced firsthand the disruption caused by the sudden loss of communications following the Amaris coup, Jennifer was amenable to Blake's suggestion, but was wary that she would be at a disadvantage if the other state lords refused. Blake happily informed her that she was the last to sign the agreement, after which Steiner gladly consented. Jerome Blake was lying, however. The Archon was the first he had met with. He was banking on the growing hostility preventing the states from conferring with each other on his activities. Each successor lord believed that they would soon be ruler over all, so the activities of the lowly Minister of Communications were of little interest to them. By the time he returned to Terra early the next year, Blake had managed to get all 5 to sign the Communications Protocol of 2787, formally recognizing HPGs as sovereign territory, acknowledging their neutrality, and agreeing to make all further payments to Comstar using their own sea bills. The Draconis Combine was still slowly chipping away at the Terran hegemony, taking the planets Deneb-Algedi and Styx in the first weeks of January, cutting off the belligerent Inglesmond from its allies. They quickly seized the worlds of Nirasaki and Quinton soon after. Later in the year, they struck at the LTV aerospace facility orbiting Inglesmond's moon, destroying the few warships the fledgling alliance had. The Coordinator's main focus was elsewhere, however, as they continued to amass forces on their border, ready to strike at their more powerful neighbour. With the Combine seemingly focused elsewhere in the Terran hegemony and Lyran Commonwealth, the AFFS continued its preparations for a strike at the Chesterton Commonality. Over 50 regiments had been transferred to staging posts along the border, their initial list of targets including key Capellan industrial worlds. To ensure that Kurita didn't launch any opportunistic land grabs once the campaign was underway, Davian ordered a strike of his own against the planet David. The raid was a great success for the AFFS. The Kuritan commander only seemed able to mobilize half of the garrison, allowing the raiders time to seize significant quantities of munitions and spare parts before withdrawing. Going completely unnoticed were the 5 other regiments on world. The Free World League's intelligence agency, SAFE, was reporting to the Captain General that Kurita was days away from launching a major invasion of the Lyran Commonwealth. Furthermore, the Archon seemed to have serious concerns about a new secret army emerging from the former Rimworld's Republic, leaving the nation besieged on all sides. With the LCAF ordered into defensive positions, Maddock felt comfortable turning his attention towards softer targets on their Spinwood flank. In late February, a quarter of the massive Marek Militia Brigade was moved to the border of the Sarna Commonality, as well as almost 40 conventional regiments and the FWLN 2nd Fleet. Their invasion would take aim at the Commonality capital, right in the heart of the Confederation. It would begin with a simultaneous assault on Harsfeld, Raman, Second Chance, and Vanra. The first 2 were secured quickly, facing only minimal resistance from the planetary militia. The Raman Lancers were not on world to defend their home planet, instead garrisoned on the neighbouring Second Chance, where they came face to face with a trio of FWLM regiments. The first shots were fired in the distant reaches of the system, as two patrolling vessels of the Sarna Commonality Fleet moved to engage the escorting trio of Freewell's warships. First kill went to the CCS Solstice, her enormous mass driver gutting one of the League destroyers in a single shot. The surviving Marek vessels had the advantage after they closed range and quickly overcame the defenders, destroying the larger Capellan battleship using nuclear missiles. Solstice attempted to retaliate with its own arsenal, but only destroyed a handful of dropships before exploding herself. The Confederation had now also learned that weapons of mass destruction were fair game in this new succession war. As the FWLS Sorunda entered orbit, they saw heavy activity at the spaceports below. It wasn't clear if the vessels about to depart were military, but the threat that dropships and aerospace fighters carrying nuclear ordnance posed was too great a risk to wait to find out. They promptly unleashed devastating orbital fire on the facilities, obliterating the fleeing civilian government within. With their loss and the realization that the planetary governors were prepared to abandon them, the Raman Lancers began to fall apart. They begrudgingly accepted General Rosenkov's call to surrender an hour later. The defenders on Vanra, despite being outnumbered 3-1, had the home field advantage as they had been stationed on World for almost 25 years. Their aerospace fighters were able to intercept and shoot down one of the approaching overlords, which crashed into the deep wilderness, forcing the rest of the regiment to redeploy to assist their comrades. The Capellans got there first, however, killing the few survivors and then ambushing the relief force. Only one battalion made it out of the forest. The battle for the capital city proved a costly affair. The charges would not give an inch, and eventually the invaders used orbital fire to level their positions. Half of Utrecht was destroyed in the bombardment, as were the remaining SECAF. Opposition on second chance had been lighter than expected, as the Capellans had only just reassigned one of the regiments in garrison to seize the Terran hegemony system of Hall. To prevent Liao reinforcements from being dispatched to help the occupied systems, a raiding force was sent to Aldebaran, deep within the Tikhonov commonality. Nearby units hunkered down, anticipating other attacks. Kenyon Manek was an ambitious man and sound military strategist. He was never wasteful or reckless with his forces, earning the respect of his commanders. In due course, this talent would earn him the nickname the Eagle. Despite his main focus being the campaign against the Capellan Confederation, he never took his eye off his other neighbour. The League Central Coordination and Command Group saw a target of opportunity on their doorstep. The Bolson shipyards within the new Kyoto system were a major resupply and refit centre for the Lyran Navy. Destroying these facilities early would pay dividends in any future escalation between the two. On February 14th, they dispatched a trio of destroyer squadrons to the system, supported by two aerospace wings. Defending the facility was a squadron of corvettes, including two of the survivors from the Bolan campaign, and an aerospace regiment of their own. The battle was fast and frenetic. The lighter Lyran warships were quickly overwhelmed, with almost a dozen destroyed in just 15 minutes. The engagement ended prematurely though, when Colonel Thompson piloted their damaged aerospace fighter into the Manek flagship's bridge, sending it on a collision trajectory of its own with the shipyards, after which both sides withdrew to lick their wounds. A second larger naval engagement followed just 10 days later on the Lyran's opposite border. The raid on Skondia the previous year had shown the LCAF to be incapable of stopping a determined assault. The Draconis Combine Admiralty formed a new 45 warship fleet, pairing them with 6 battlemech regiments and several more supporting units, tasked with the objective of pushing all the way to the provincial capital of Skye. The first step would be a return to Skondia, where this time they would conquer the world for the Dragon. In the months leading up to the attack, the solitary mech regiment in garrison had been reinforced by 2 others, plus 5 warships and 20 escort dropships. While this meant it was one of the better defended worlds in the Commonwealth, it could not hope to match the approaching task force. Upon arrival at the system's nadir jump point, Pedersen quickly realized that things had gone horribly wrong. Since the attack on New Kyoto, the Lyran Navy had been pooling their warships in the region into a single fleet based out of Skondia. now numbering some 50 Lyran warships and another 200 smaller vessels. Most of the fleet was in orbit over the planet itself, which gave the Taisho the opportunity to withdraw. Instead, he commanded all the ships under his command to form up into a cone and dove straight into the heart of the defences, punching a hole for the transports to reach Skondia. Van Hadden's warships were primarily anti-capital vessels, which meant despite their best efforts, they were only able to destroy around 20% of the smaller dropships before they entered orbit. Focusing on the transports also allowed the many carriers in the DCA fleet to launch their aerospace fighters, which inflicted huge losses on the Lyrans. By the end of March, 2/3 of the Commonwealth fleet had been destroyed, including the Admiral's flagship. The Curitans had lost half of their force by comparison. The ground campaign now swung even more in the Combine's favour as they were able to call down orbital fire on exposed Lyran positions. Nevertheless, they held out for 2 months before calling in the remaining naval support for extraction. Back in the Freeworld League, the Eagle was driving his force onwards. Hassad, Shepar and Singhai were taken from the Capellans by his advancing Marek militia, but the primary target lay within another region of space. New Dallas was one of the strongest planets left to the Terran hegemony, and had become a provincial capital after the loss of Tirfing. The planetary militia had fought Amaris tooth and nail, and were expected to be equally belligerent towards any successor state that approached. 3 FWLM regiments entered the system on March 20th, and ran face first into the reformed New Dallas Rangers, equipped with Royal Tier battle mechs piloted by veterans of the Starleague Civil War. The Marek militia was completely wiped out, and the Atrian Dragoons were on the back foot until they resorted to using their nuclear arsenal. 300,000 within Cato City were vaporized in order to eliminate the pair of militia battalions in defense, after which the survivors surrendered. New Dallas was in Marek hands, its worth now all but useless. Within a month of the Draconis Combine making landfall on Skondia, Jennifer Steiner ordered a series of reprisal raids. She did not want to commit her military to an offensive against the Dragon, but she hoped that keeping the Coordinator off balance would reduce the number of attacks coming her way. There was no better way to achieve this than a strike on the capital itself. This dangerous assignment was given to Duke Graham Kalswa and his Tamar Tigers. Their transport for the mission was one of the few remaining Potemkin-class troop cruisers, with a full complement of 25 dropships. They expected an enormous naval presence, but they found only 2 smaller warships. The location of the DCA fleet was a mystery, but they had no time to consider it. Taking full advantage of their weakness, the Nightwind made a beeline for the colossal shipyards, the largest within the Combine, and destroyed the facility while the Tigers made their descent. The defending mech regiments huddled around Imperial City, allowing the attackers to ride roughshod over the Aichi continent. Several major factories were destroyed before the Duke withdrew 3 days later. Minoru Kurita had been humiliated by how powerless he was to respond. The famous Black Pearl at the heart of the Draconis Combine had been desecrated. Worse was to follow at Dieron in April. The DCA had a warship squadron in orbit over the world, part of their ongoing invasion of the Terran hegemony. They were tasked with the defense of the Stella Trek Naval Yard, the main objective for the Lyran raid. A half-dozen Steiner warships appeared in system, unleashing 2 squadrons of nuclear-armed assault dropships to clear a path for them. The aging Aegis-class Selene was blown apart by their missiles, forcing the Essex destroyers to break off, giving the Tharkad and Commonwealth-class cruisers a clear shot at the shipyard. Radstad was undergoing service and decoupled from the facility with most of her guns still offline and barely any crew aboard. She attempted to ram the largest battlecruiser, but was destroyed before making contact. Gallery and York now launched their nuclear payload at the facility, destroying another of the Draconis Combine's vital space docks. The 4 DCA destroyers regrouped, almost succeeding in destroying the Lyran flagship before they themselves were eliminated. Meanwhile, the raiding party was making landfall. They had their own objectives on the ground. This was the first outing for Colonel Raymond Hempstead's stealths. The Lyran Commonwealth had tremendous faith in his abilities, putting the mercenary commander in charge of the entire operation. The reason he had such a solid reputation was because his unit had acquitted themselves well during the Starleague Civil War, fighting for Amaris as the 23rd Republican Light Lancers. After 4 hours on the ground, it became clear that something had gone wrong in space. They had not received a single message from the 4 surviving cruisers. Ground operations were quickly wrapped up and the dropships departed. A brief search of their last known location turned up only wreckage fragments, forcing the raiders to withdraw to their jump ships. The fate of the warships remains a mystery, the answer perhaps lying somewhere in the debris field known as the Junkyard, the detritus left from the space battle during Operation Chieftain. It's possible that the Lyran ships fell victim to something lurking in the radioactive debris. In the neighbouring system, the Curitans were again picking at the remains of the Terran hegemony. When they arrived at Safel, however, they found it was defended by elements of the Blue Star Irregulars. The former soldiers of the Amaris Empire Armed Forces knew the location of a hidden AEAF cache and had raced ahead to secure it for the Federated Suns. Rather than engage them, the Taisar purposely diluted his strength by spreading them across the planet, then withdrew shortly after. This was exactly as Warlord Jinjiro Kurita had ordered. Safel was just one of a dozen minor skirmishes the AFFS had won against the Draconis Combine during 2787. Another came at Kaf, where a force sent to flank the Confederation and establish a link to Terra defeated a small force of CCAF and DCMS opponents, evening the score for the debacle on town. Several other hegemony systems were taken to broaden their control of that vital link. FedSun's military intelligence was receiving reports from one of their marshals that something big was going on just across the border, but the head of MI2 for the region had dismissed his concerns. John Davian was busy marshalling his forces for a strike at the Chesterton commonality, and was not hearing anything that might worry him from the Draconis March. On May 1st, 2787, Jinjiro Kurita began the largest offensive campaign of the Succession Wars. 15 mech regiments and a further 55 conventional units stationed around Tanel moved simultaneously against the 7 systems within the Cussor pocket. They struck so quickly that most worlds failed to alert the rest of the Federated Suns that they were under attack. The best AFFS units within the region had already been redeployed ahead of the planned Capellan offensive, leaving only second-line regiments in garrison. The mercenaries on Marduk fled at their approach, while others stood and fought, not realizing that they were at the epicenter of a Kuritan tsunami. The attack on the Paris Bulge was just the first of 3 DCMS task forces set to advance into Davian territory. Jinjiro had amassed over 50 battlemech regiments along the border, representing more than a third of the entire Draconis Combine mustered soldiery. Supporting them were 150 regiments of conventional forces. On May 4th, Jinjiro led a second attack into the Dahar combat region, spearheaded by the First Sword of Light. At the same time, a third wave crashed into the Clovis combat region. On point was the Third Sword of Light, and with them was none other than the coordinator Minoru Kurita himself. Their main goal was the regional headquarters on Clovis. The FedSun's navy had only a trio of warships on hand to defend the system, while the Draconis Combine Admiralty assigned a squadron from their third fleet to clear a
Got our
path from
Black
Minari.
Knight. At
Things
least base
concluded in
good
space
for now.
predictably.
It's gonna
It
need
gave
a
the three
lot
Davian
more
armor
paint.
regiments
There's a
and the
lot
unassigned
of little
Clovis
crevices
guards
on the
some
sky.
vital time to
You need to get
reinforce their
those
position.
undersides that are here.
They were outnumbered 5-1, but were nonetheless able to hold their ground.
There's a lot more to do with it.
ISF agents
did
have
get
reported
done.
an additional 2 mech
We have our
regiments that went
Zeus.
on Weld, which
We
caused
have
the
our Hatchet
Curitans to
Man,
fight
though.
conservatively until they
That's
realized
2 more.
their mistake. Furthermore, the presence of the coordinator prevented them from doing anything as dishonorable as using weapons of mass destruction. The Field Marshal had been desperately calling for reinforcements throughout the attack, but the Combine invasion was so absolute that near every other system in range was also under attack. Only a single vessel arrived from Kosa, but by this point, Simons could see the battle was lost. He ordered them to call off their landing while he would attempt to withdraw. While some of the survivors were able to escape, the Field Marshal was not among them. his dropship intercepted by Kiritan aerospace fighters and destroyed while leaving atmosphere. His death was a major blow to both coordination and morale in the region. It's often said that the decision not to attack the Lyran Commonwealth, as everyone had expected the Draconis Combine to do, was made by Minoru to comply with the tenets of Bushido, which he held in high esteem. Bushido says that a weak opponent, as House Steiner had proven themselves to be, should be given time to prepare themselves further, so that they might fight honourably. In truth, Jinjiro had long ago convinced his father to strike at the Federated Suns, and their actions along the Lyran border were simply part of an elaborate ruse, one that had successfully duped the rest of the Inner Sphere. Word of the invasion did not reach First Prince John Davian on Muskegon until the 3rd week of May. He frantically dispatched orders to those units he could reach to withdraw from the Draconis March and establish a new defensive line at the edge of the Crucis March. Unfortunately, the provincial attitudes that plagued the AWS were preventing any sort of coordinated response. Some regiments would not abandon their homes and foolishly tried to hunker down and weather the storm. Others, who had only recently been moved to the Draconis border, up and fled the moment they received their orders. Federated Suns' losses were horrific during this first month, and the defensive line that the First Prince had hoped to establish was full of holes. The DCMS employed an unusual strategy to great effect during their advance. They would arrive in system, quickly destroy all communications facilities, naval assets, and any Fed Suns troops in the open, and then promptly depart. They spent as little time on ground as possible before jumping to their next target. This left large pockets of resistance in their wake, but those troops had no means of leaving the system or coordinating an effective defense. In the subsequent months, less experienced second-line Kiritan units would arrive to mop up what was left. The advance was happening so quickly that tracking exactly where the front line was became almost impossible, both for the AWFS commanders trying to organise a defence, and for us historians attempting to follow along. Centuries removed from the conflict, we can only make vague approximations as to how far Kirita had penetrated into the Federated Suns. By the end of the first month, the DCMS had made serious inroads into 2 of the Draconis March operational areas. Almost all of the Clovis combat region had been taken, most of Dahar and Robinson, and half a dozen systems within Fairfax. All this had been achieved with very few casualties. The only notable losses were the 1st and 3rd Sword of Light, who had been at the forefront of several major battles. An elite corps of survivors would go on to form the new 6th and 8th Sword of Light regiments, adopting as their sigil the Pillars of Ivory and Jade. The success of Jinjiro's campaign was so shocking that 3 mortal enemies, the Capellan Confederation, Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth, briefly contemplated signing a mutual non-aggression pact with the powerful Draconis Combine. Ultimately, Steiner had already lost too many worlds to allow it, and there was too much ill will between Liao and Marek for an alliance there. By comparison to the Kiritan onslaught, Kenya Marek's 50 regiment invasion of the Capellan Confederation was positively quaint. In May, they seized control of Old Kentucky without a fight after discovering the planetary garrison had fled before their approach. House Steiner was a constant irritant though, periodically probing the defences of the Bowl and Thumb. A raid on Roche turned into a full assault, one which cost the Boland Defenders Brigade another of their units. Significant use of WMDs scarred the world to the point where the LCAF abandoned it soon after. Roche fell back into Marek hands, but there was nothing of value left in the debris. The only other major action was when the Free Worlds League took Wyatt, a former Terran system that the Lyrans had seized a few years earlier. Despite being the first to declare war on each other, the Lyran League border remained one of the quietest during this early phase of the war. The Marek militia continued their advance in July, quickly seizing Shamdo and Fact. Wazn seemed as if it would fall just as easily. A pair of Marek militia regiments made landfall and took both the capital and spaceport without incident, but scouts then discovered the presence of the Old Kentucky Lancers. They had dug in at one of the smaller cities, awaiting Holbright's approach. She instead ordered the firebombing of the city, wiping out half of the regiment and countless civilians within. Things played out in similar fashion on Kori. The unit sent to take the world were engaged by one of the CCAF's new regiments formed from SLDF remnants. They withdrew from the spaceport after a brief clash and set up positions within the capital city. An additional 2 companies of catapults bolstered their defense, straight from the planet's mech factories. This prompted Colonel Gaines to call in orbital strikes, again demolishing large parts of the city. The survivors withdrew into the hills. With the exception of picking at the Terran hegemony bones, the Capellan Confederation armed forces had so far barely played a part in the First Succession War. The Mechwarrior had kept Barbara Liao informed of the growing Davian task force near Chesterton, and it had blinded her to the Marek invasion that came from the opposite direction. Now she sought to regain some of the initiative. At the risk of coming into conflict with a third successor state, the Capellan Chancellor gathered together a trio of Liao and Tikhonov lancers and tasked them with seizing Davian worlds within the Clovis combat region before Kurita could organize an assault. She recognized that each realm would have Terra as one of its main targets for the war, and it was worth the risk to shut the Federated Suns out of any future battle for humanity's homeworld. By August, she had taken Angol, Rio, and Tybalt. While they prepared for their next jump, Barbara turned her attention towards dealing with the Eagle. The brutal tactics employed by the Marek militia colonels on Kori and Wazan had failed to eliminate the planetary garrisons, and now the survivors rose up in rebellion. Further back, the Grand Duchy of Orient had sent a pair of its regiments to garrison the New Worlds. The Hussard Lancers struck at the newly arrived forces before they had settled into defensive positions. In September, the Marek militia assault force redeployed in an effort to stamp out the rebellion, but they proved particularly stubborn. The CCAF launched their follow-on attacks against another trio of worlds within the Clovis combat region the following month. By the end of November, Heen, New Florence, and Ronald had all been added to the Tikhonov commonality. That same month proved to be the last for the few remaining defenders on Kori and Wazan. Orient dispatched more garrison forces in December to defend the Free World's latest conquests and free up the Marek militia to continue towards Sana. Or at least, that was their plan, until the Capellan Navy ambushed their waiting jump ships. The League warships in orbit above the worlds attempted to move to their aid, but the distance was far too great. The Liao vessels now moved to intercept. Their victory was a decisive one. All 7 Free Worlds League Navy ships were destroyed at the cost of only 2 from the Confederation, plus a third that lost all drive. This left 8 FWLM regiments stranded deep within the Sana commonality at the mercy of the hostile naval vessels overhead. As the Inner Sphere entered December 2787, the first year of the Succession Wars was coming to a close. The brutality on display had shocked all involved. They hoped for a decisive victory. 238 years later, we're still waiting.
Five, which is Apocalypse. We'll come back to that next week. But in the meantime, I hope everybody enjoyed hanging out with me for a little bit. Sorry we couldn't get the chance to chat as much as we normally would. But I will see you guys next time. Sweet. Carry on. Keep committing those war crimes. Feel free to bring some comments, concerns, or questions next time around. I'm always happy to answer them. I'm always also happy to keep watching more Battletech lore. Sven makes a good video. Definitely go check out the original video. Sven Vanderplank, absolutely fantastic historian for Battletech. Phenomenal project that he runs. Please go check him out. Please go learn more about Battletech lore. It is fantastic. This is a collated video of a bunch of his smaller ones, which is, each one of these is a chapter, which is an entire video that he made on his own, that is then put entirely together. This includes the entirety of the American Civil War, the beginning of the Age of War. He's going through the entire thing. I believe he's on the Fourth Succession War right now. Eventually ending in 3150 current era timeline. But he's trekking through it, so definitely go check it out. Complete 35 history of the First Succession War. That's where I left off with all of this video. So you can tell that there's a lot of content. In the meantime, keep calm, carry on, keep committing to war crime. See you all next time. Bye-bye.
Battletech IP.